I had the distinct pleasure of virtually meeting Dr. Soh-Hyun Altino this past March as we both started around the same time at Wheaton during the height of COVID. We were able to commiserate a bit about the trials of starting our positions during such a precarious times. However, it was during that first conversation I was able to also see Dr. Altino's passion for both the Lord and the music arts that showed why she was needed and belongs here at Wheaton. During our interaction, I was able to learn of her unique interest for Korean traditional music. She shared her story with me of how, by persevering through multiple trials and difficulties, God opened up the way for her to travel and learn from a Sanjo master in Changgu, Korea during the height of COVID. It was in the process of learning this traditional Korean instrument that she articulated a vision of synergizing her classical training of violin with the unique sounds and styles of the Korean Sanjo. In the work of global engagement, where I apply my trade for Wheaton, education is a tool and platform used to bridge the differences between nationalities and cultures. Education plays a major role in the transmission of cultures as it enlightens, guides, and challenges people to incorporate differences as an opportunity to expand our perspectives and to appreciate how God has created each culture uniquely in His image. Music and education especially is an ideal platform to connect different cultures and styles. It allows practitioners and admirers of music to be able to appreciate the innate and unique beauty that the Lord has imbued to every culture. And when there are opportunities to integrate different musical styles, sometimes a convergence takes place that leads to the birth of something entirely new and harmonious. Today, as we anticipate Dr. Altino's performance, we'll have the opportunity to experience this convergence as we'll see how the Korean Sanjo and the classical violin will be bridged to transcend a new sound for our enjoyment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming to this presentation, and thank you, Mr. Kong, for the very kind introduction. My name is Soh-Hyun Park Altino, and I'm honored to have this opportunity to introduce Korean Sanjo to you today. Later in the presentation, I'll be performing a traditional Sanjo on the violin with a colleague of mine on the Korean drum called changgu. This will be the very first public performance of the traditional Korean Sanjo played on a Western stringed instrument. When I look back on how this research began a little over 2 years ago, I cannot believe that I actually went ahead with it because I didn't know anything about Sanjo, didn't know whether I would even like the traditional music, and certainly never imagined that I would be speaking about Sanjo in front of an audience like this. In my journey with Sanjo, I have been learning again and again what it takes to get to know and embrace a people, culture, language, and sounds that are completely different from what I know and feel comfortable with. Perhaps because I knew nothing about this music, it has been easy to recognize God's hand in this research. There were countless moments when I knew that it was God who was opening the specific doors to the places, opportunities, teachers, and even to my own heart. I say my heart because now I love the traditional Sanjo, even though the learning process has been extremely difficult. In preparing for today, I often felt overwhelmed by the many things I wanted to share with you. I made a list and kept adding to it, and one of the heavy-duty ones had to do with what my Korean identity, Korean-American identity, means to me now. But clearly, there isn't enough time to talk about such a big topic in this short time we have together. So today, I will stick to telling you about my research and hope to have further conversations with you. First, I'd like to tell you a bit about my background. I was born in Seoul, Korea, grew up in a musical family, and began learning the violin at age 6. My maternal grandfather, Eun Young-la, was one of the most important Korean composers, a lifetime educator and a pioneer who firmly believed that modern Korean compositions must be grounded in the native, then modernized. I came to the US in 1989 in 10th grade, alone without my family, in pursuit of better learning opportunities in music. I did not speak English, and everything about American culture and school was new to me. I went to college, met Jesus while dealing with a long-term tendinitis, got my master's and doctorate, got a teaching job at a university, and became a wife and a mom. All my adult life, I have been a workaholic. I hate to admit it, but I generally stick to what I know because I like getting things done quickly and without messiness. Until about 2 years ago, I didn't give much thought to my being Korean. I did not like Korean food, which helped, and was never involved in Korean communities or churches. I didn't think I would fit in. And this is why, although I had never listened to traditional Korean music, I just assumed that I wouldn't like it. How did this research begin, you might ask? 5 years ago, for some reason, I decided to play my grandfather's 1955 composition for violin and piano on my recital, called Sanjo for Violin and Piano. Not knowing what Sanjo was, I had to look it up on Wikipedia. My pianist mother was visiting me from Korea at the time, so I asked her to help me figure out how to play this piece with the appropriate style because it had a lot of Korean elements in it. She sang the melodies for me many times, but if truth be told, both of us, teachers of Western music, felt that we were mostly guessing. That did not sit well in me, so about 3 years ago, while I was working at UW-Madison, I applied and received a 2-year research grant so that I could go to Korea to learn how to play my grandfather's sanjo better. Keeping with my grandfather's maxim, it seemed like a good idea to look into gugak, or traditional Korean music. In my first research trip to Seoul, which took place in the summer of 2019, God opened the door for me to meet a handful of incredible performers and teachers of gugak. Once I began my study, I found out that my grandfather had indeed passionately advocated for traditional music beginning in the 1950s, right around the time he composed his sanjo. Following my grandfather's footsteps, although we never talked about any of this when he was alive, I decided to attempt to learn to play the traditional ajaeng sanjo on the violin. Ajaeng seemed a logical choice not only because it's a bowed stringed instrument, but because the person who developed the smaller sized ajaeng for sanjo in the 1930s was a violinist. One of my teachers chose a version of sanjo for me to learn, and it was the sanjo composed by ajaeng master Kim Ilgu. So you might ask, what is sanjo? Sanjo is a genre of traditional instrumental music played by a solo melodic instrument with a drum accompaniment. This genre, which began to develop in the late 19th century, is now considered, along with pansori, the pinnacle of Korea's traditional art music. Sanjo's melodic phrases evolve gradually over the performer-composer's career, and the fixed version is meticulously learned and memorized by their pupils, and they pass it on to their next generation. When the pupils become masters themselves, they may add their own ideas to their master's version. All genres of the traditional folk music and dance employ Korea's unique rhythmic cycles called changdan. Each type of changdan is associated with certain tempo and feel, and the melodic phrases breathe and dance within the frame of these repeated rhythmic cycles. My grandfather considered changdan to be most fundamental to Korean folk music. He frequently employed changdan in his compositions, and in his lectures, he urged all Koreans to know and enjoy changdan. Drummers in Korean folk music improvise within the changdan grid, always responding to the melodic instrumentalist's phrasing in the moment. I think of the drummers as both the accompanists and conductors, as they do the work of supporting and leading at the same time. In my opinion, Sanjo is the most advanced form of chamber music. Sanjo was born out of pansori, a genre of traditional vocal music based on narrative literature, which emerged in the early 18th century. One complete work of pansori may last 4 to 8 hours, and one singer sings and acts out every character while a drummer provides the changdan accompaniment, combined with vocalized encouragement or agreement called 추임새. You will hear 추임새 in today's performance. Pansori expresses the depth of emotions of the olden Korea's farming communities, whose livelihood depended on rice farming. A very long winter of not enough to eat preceded a year of very hard work and hope for harvest. Farming families were frequently victims of social injustice and oppression inflicted by the wealthy upper class. Their anguish, pain, longing, anger, hope, and abandon is expressed in pansori and sanjo, and it was greatly intensified during the 35-year-long Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945. My grandfather was born in 1922, right in the middle of that dark time. A well-known translator and a scholar in the field of Korean literature, Marshall R. Peale, wrote this in the 1990s about the heart of pansori. As the pansori singer strives to reflect everyday life and so mirror the realities of his listeners' lives, the sufferings and lamentations of his characters are frequently less in service of the plot than of an audience's need for catharsis. Although in some pansori plots, distress and suffering lead eventually to a happy result, the process of suffering itself seems more important to the audience than the happy outcome, or, for that matter, than any laughter elicited by its critical view of the world. Pansori distinguishes itself as popular literature by eliciting sympathy through suffering. It gives its audience a means to endure sorrow. I can't agree more with his comment. Pansori gives its audience a means to endure sorrow. Now I would like to share a short clip of a pansori performance. The female singer is performing a scene from the Song of Shimcheong, in which an old, impoverished, blind man is lamenting about how he lost his only daughter. She had sold herself for 300 sacks of rice in desperate hope of bringing healing to her father's blind eyes.
효성 있는 딸 자식이 남경장사 선인들께 삼백석 몸이 팔려 인당수 채수로 죽은 지가 3년이요. 눈도 뜨지 못하고 자식 팔아먹은 놈을 살려 도와 쓸 때에서 당장 목숨을 끊어 주어.
As you heard, the voice and expression of the pansori singer in this scene is strong, hoarse, choked, and full of anguish. The concept of tone and tone production is entirely different from that in Western music, and interestingly, Korean musicians compared this timbre to the fermentation used in much of the Korean traditional foods, such as kimchi. Like kimchi, pansori is an acquired taste. Once you get hooked on pansori or the taste of kimchi, though, it's hard to substitute it with anything else. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Although no musical instrument could ever sing as powerfully as the human voice, the sound and expression of the pansori singers is what sanjo performers seek to convey through the voice of their instruments. A sanjo performance can be as short as 8 minutes or as long as 1 hour long. After I decided to learn to play the traditional sanjo on the violin, I spent night after night, for months, listening to and admiring pansori. Both the words and sounds seemed to go straight to my heart. In fact, I couldn't believe I had lived all of my life without knowing this incredible music. Sanjo is abstract music, and it progresses through several movements that are set to different types of changdan cycles. Traditional sanjos always begin in the slowest changdan, and the tempo gets faster with each movement. As it ends, the solo instrument plays an improvisation-like section to bring back the slow and lamenting character. The typical sanjo learning process consists of having daily lessons, lots of practicing, or at least every other day lessons with the master teacher as students learn by copying the teacher's playing exactly, with almost no sheet music, and put everything to memory. In older days, it was common for the pupils to live in the teacher's home to learn the attitudes and ways of living, as all aspects of life were thought to come through in one sanjo playing. My sanjo learning process was quite different because, one, there was no teacher of ajaeng, let alone the performer of the Kim Ilgu school of ajaeng sanjo in any cities I could drive to. Two, because no other string or wind players trained in Western music had worked out the traditional sanjo on their instrument, there wasn't anyone I could call to ask about tips, the tips to sound more authentic, or shall I say, speak Korean on the violin. So instead, I learned the ajaeng sanjo by repeatedly watching and imitating the performance videos of Master Kim Ilgu on YouTube. I also took many online video lessons with a sanjo changgu artist in Seoul who was willing to think outside the box because he believed that the violin possessed many of the qualities and capabilities similar to those of the traditional Korean instruments. I did go to Korea 4 times in the past 2 years to study despite COVID, and when I was there, I had daily lessons, which was very intensive. As I got deeper into learning sanjo, I began to see my role as a translator or interpreter. Learning sanjo felt exactly like learning a foreign language. I was reminded of my first couple of years in the US when I had a terrible time pronouncing words with L's, RL's, J's, V's, W's, and more, like girl, wood, jazz, world, and live. I can go on and on. They were so difficult simply because these sounds do not exist in spoken Korean. My ears could not discern the details, and therefore my mouth didn't know how to form the sounds. It was very frustrating and even embarrassing to see that people didn't understand what I was saying. It also took much time and effort to learn the vocabulary, inflections, idioms, facial expressions, and even social expectations before I could have quality conversations. Sanjo learning was just like that. Take a quick listen to the ajaeng sanjo performed by Master Kim Ilgu. Now is the time to raise the screen, which is going to make some noise. I don't want you to be scared. Just as English and Korean languages have almost nothing in common, every element of Sanjo's musical language is opposite or at least very different from the Western musical language. In the first several months of studying, my ears simply could not discern the tones, pitches, articulations, rhythms, and inflections, no matter how hard I tried. In fact, just how much I could not tell what was going on was shocking to me, since listening well and playing what I hear is what I do for a living. I ended up questioning everything I had known about music in general. Sanjo has been the most difficult thing I've learned as a musician, and it has been quite humbling and also very good for me. I'd like to read something that Homer B. Hulbert, an American missionary, wrote in 1896 regarding Korean music. It's singing. And there's the drum. So this is something that Homer Hulbert, an American missionary in Korea, wrote in 1896. In spite of the evidence to the contrary borne to our ears on every summer breeze, Korean music is not a myth. The sounds seem peculiar and are far from pleasing because we do not know or feel what they are intended to express. And we bring to them not the Korean temperament and training, but the more artificial Western ear. We say they do not keep time, which is as just a stricter as it would be to say that Shakespeare's verse does not rhyme. Why should they keep time? There's no analogy for it in nature. The thrush does not keep time, and the skylark, that joy of Korean waste places, cares not for bars and dotted notes. As a pure expression of feeling, music should no more be hampered by time than poetry is by rhyme. Koreans like our music as little as we like theirs, and for the same reason, they do not know what we are driving at. So I beg you to suspend your judgment of Korean music until you can listen to it, so to speak, with Korean ears. There are many striking differences between the Western art music and the Korean traditional art music. I'll mention a few of them. Korean changdan or rhythmic cycles are based on breath, not pulse. Therefore, tempos are slower in general, and there's more spaciousness from beat to beat in Sanjo. On the violin, extremely slow bow speeds are needed to prevent the sound from ringing freely. Korean melodic phrases employ ever-changing and curving lines. Instead of having fixed places for pitches or measured distances between the fixed pitches, the curving lines pass through microtones. It reminds me of a wild calligraphy work. Western violinists practice hard to play every fixed note in tune, so listening to and playing the constantly bending pitches was enormously challenging. Traditional Korean music does not employ harmony, which serves as a foundation to most Western music, art music. Instead, Korean ensemble music is about heterophony, in which several variations of the same melodic line are played simultaneously. I love listening to traditional ensemble playing. Each instrument plays distinct melodic phrases, yet they all somehow fit together. Melodic phrases communicate personal and heartfelt expressions through refined ornamentations and techniques called shigimse. Shigimse makes Sanjo sound more like pansori singers talking and crying. Because they are idiomatic to the spoken Korean language, they're very different from the ornaments used in Western music. I use many types of glissandos to create the shigimse effect. How every shigimse ornament should sound is carefully learned in daily Sanjo lessons. I must not vibrate on every note. In fact, how wide the vibrato needs to be and how many oscillations per note there should be is quite specific. It was fascinating to see that my shigimse got so much better when I broke my left hand's ring finger last April. It was a terrible thing to happen to a violinist, but when I began practicing my sanjo music with only 3 fingers, not having the normal 4-fingered left hand, it helped me speak much better Korean on the violin. God turned the disastrous situation into a huge blessing. Emotionally speaking, while there are moments of outbursts, much of pansori and sanjo is about restraint and holding in. Often long notes end with abrupt accents, not with ringing releases as in Western music, and it conveys the Korean philosophy of enduring hardship and pain in silence. In addition to my being a translator of traditional music, I saw that my position was ideal for bridging the gap between the people of the Western and Korean music. A severe disconnect between the musicians of Western music and of traditional music has stood for well over 100 years, even within Korea, precisely because the two groups speak completely different musical languages and cannot understand each other. Traditional music has long been looked down as the music of the uneducated lower class, while Western music is esteemed as the music of the learned and cultured. My being a professional musician and teacher of Western music in the US and wanting to learn sanjo seems to be a mystery to many Korean musicians trained in Western music. Some of them have expressed their curiosity about traditional music, and I have had several opportunities to speak and advocate for traditional music and to honor the traditional artists. A year after I began my sanjo study, I met the 80-year-old ajaeng master Kim Ilgu in Jeonju and played for him his sanjo on my violin. He told me that not only had he never heard a Western instrument play sanjo, but he had never been in the same room with a violin before. He was overjoyed at the new possibility of taking sanjo out to the world. Shortly after I met Master Kim Ilgu in 2020, I video recorded the violin version of the ajaeng sanjo as my research outcome, and this video has received a lot of enthusiasm. Several Korean patrons of Gugak reached out to tell me that they had waited for decades for somebody to do this very work. July of this year, I went back to Korea for more lessons with Master Kim Ilgu, and now he says I am one of his pupils. I am also waiting on a new commission, a composition for violin and changgu that would employ traditional musical elements to be written by a Korean-German composer who shares a similar vision. I have a strong feeling that I'm continuing the work of my grandfathers. My grandfather was a sincere Christian, and among his countless compositions are over 1,000 hymns that he felt God had called him to write. These hymns incorporate changdan and other idioms of the traditional music. He believed that Koreans needed worship music that reflected their Korean heritage. Whenever I see or meet a non-Korean person speaking Korean, I know instinctively that he or she is deeply interested in knowing about Korea and Koreans. By embracing the language of another nation, we validate, affirm, and show care for the people and their country. I have never been on a formal mission trip, but learning Korean sanjo seems to be a way that God has chosen to reveal how I can love and embrace those that I would not have even met otherwise. Whatever the field or discipline, may God bless us and be glorified in all of our efforts to love those that He brings to our lives. Thank you again for coming and listening to my story. Please email me if you'd like to continue the conversations. Now I'll go and fetch my violin and the wonderful accompanist who is going to play changgu and be back to play for you the Kim Ilgu School of Ajaeng Sanjo, the violin version. Thank you.
아